Up to this point, we've had a fairly static character set up. We don't really have a way of transitioning between a bunch of different animations, so we're going to fix that by creating a state machine. Inside of our anim graph, which we can see here, we can right click, type in state machine, and add a new state machine. We can rename this by clicking on it or rename it at the top right. I'm going to rename mine to locomotion. So we know that this state machine is for moving our character around. You notice it has an animation pose output. And you notice we have animation pose inputs on our blends. Yeah, you could blend state machines together. You might have one for maybe lower body movement and upper body movement. In this case, we're just going to use our locomotion for all of our animation. We'll open up the locomotion by double clicking it. On the left, you'll notice locomotion is part of the anim graph. At the top, you'll notice we only have locomotion and event graph for our attached graphs. So even though we're in locomotion, it's still part of the event graph, but we have some breadcrumbs at the top, which will come in useful later. How state machines work is basically it comes in, figures out what state it should be in based on some values, and does something. So inside of here, we'll go into the entry. We're going to add a state. We're going to name this idle/walk. And this is where we're going to determine if we should be idling or walking. So when we come in, should we be idling or walking? You also have access to conduits. We're not going to cover those, but that helps you get animations through certain areas. For now, we just need to have different states: idling, walking, jumping. Inside of our idle walk, if we open it up, it should look familiar. It wants to know what should our output pose be. We're going to use our breadcrumbs to go back to anim graph. We're going to select all of the stuff we used before for our blend, Control X to cut it out, go back to our idle walk state. On the left over here, you can see I'm jumping right to it, and we're going to paste it in. We'll hook it up, and now whenever the idle walk state is fired off, it's going to go ahead and properly play back idling or walking based on the input speed. We'll go ahead and compile that, and our character is now broken. Well, it's broken because even though our locomotion is set to work properly, our anim graph isn't set to use our locomotion. So let's hook that up, compile, and now we're back to like we had before. And if we were to play test, you could see when we walk, it starts doing the zombie walk. This is good. How do we do the rest of our stuff? Let's open our locomotion back up and let's look at adding more states. The animations that were included with the third-party template for jumping are set up in 3 parts. Start jumping, when you're in the air, loop, and then when you're done, end or land. So we need to set that up. We can drag off of any of the outside parts of our state and drop it, add a state. We're going to call this one jump start. We're going to try to match the names of our animations. Drag off of jump start, add a state, call this one jump loop. Drag off again of jump loop, add a state, jump end. And we know once we end, we're going to go back to idle walk. You notice each of these arrows, these transitions, has a little connector. These are the transition rules, which we're going to cover in a second. You don't have to go one way. We could have it go from walking back to jump end for some reason, or into the loop for some reason. Maybe we were walking and then all of a sudden we fell off, but we didn't actually start jumping. Maybe we wanted to go right to jump loop. You have many ways of doing things. You can have connectors back and forth. If you don't want them anymore, click on the connector, press delete on the keyboard to delete them. But in our instance, we want to make sure when we start jumping, we play the start animation, then we loop, then we end. And our transition rules determine how that all works. Now, one thing that we have a problem with is we're not actually playing any animations. So go inside each of our transitions here, our little states, and tell it what to do. In our jump start, we simply want it to play back jump start. We'll go back to locomotion, jump loop. When jump loop is fired off, we play back jump loop. Go back to locomotion, go to jump end, and when jump end is played back, we want to play jump end. We'll compile, we'll go back to locomotion. We have some errors down here. Well, yeah, it's saying it's never going to transition because, well, you've never set up any rules. That is true. And if we were to go ahead and test this, it's never really going to get out of here. Now, here's something that's really neat. You can test and debug all of this inside of the preview editor by setting it up. At the top, we have a debug filter. Now, it might default to something, but what we care about is the preview instance. This instance here, this little guy, he's our preview instance. This is what's happening right now. He is stuck in our idle walk for that many seconds. Inside of our idle walk, he's playing the third person idle. We're not moving around, duh, that's what's going to happen. Let's go back in. How do we get him to jump? Well, let's set up with our rule. We'll double click on our transition rule, and it's going to ask us, okay, when can we go from idle walk? You can see at the top, idle walk to jump start. What is our rule? That one's simple. When is falling becomes true. We'll drag this in here, get it, and connect it. Now, whenever is falling is true, basically whenever our character starts jumping, is falling will become true. Our transition is valid, and we can go from idling or walking to jump start. We can test this. We'll hit play. We can move our character around, and we hit jump. The jump start works, and then it keeps going. Well, why does it keep going? Well, let's take a look. You can see him jumping in the background. We'll go back to our animation graph that's running. We're going to change our debug filter at the top to our character that's currently in the engine. Now you can see him jumping. Go back to locomotion, and you'll see why. This animation is continually playing because we transitioned to it, but we never gave it a rule to get out. And if we look in here, you can see it's just continually running. And you'll look at the top right, it's set to loop, so therefore it's going to keep looping. Well, let's set up the rest of our rules then. This is kind of silly. We'll go ahead and stop that. We'll go back to our locomotion, and let's set up the other rules. So this one was simple. Going from walking to starting is if we start is falling. If the first time is falling becomes true, we immediately are jumping. We want that to start. But our next rule is going from starting to looping. We want that to play back when your jump start has finished. We can go in here. Now, our animation is called third person jump underscore start. So let's right click and type jump underscore start. And you're going to see we have a couple things in here. What's the current time for that playback? Maybe we want to transition once it's gone past half a second. Or the nice thing is you have ratios. So in here you see time remaining ratio, third person jump start. So this will give me 0 to 1 or 0 to 100% of how much has passed of this third person jump start. Remember the animation we're coming from? And once it gets past a certain point, I can say, okay, go ahead and go to the next part. So I can do, let's see, this is the remaining ratio. So we want to go with less than. So if it's less than or equal to a certain percentage, we're going to go with 0.1. So if it's 10% or less, it's almost done. It's 90% played through. We'll go and transition to the next rule. We'll hit compile. If we wanted to, we could go and hit play and we could test this out. Or we could use the preview editor. In the bottom right in our asset browser, we have anim preview editor, and this allows us to test the values we've set over here, these variables. So any variables you have inside of your blueprint in this anim blueprint can be tested in real time. So if we check is falling, you notice in the top left, it immediately does the is falling. We go back to locomotion. We change our debug filter to the preview. You can see where it's at. So if we uncheck or check things, it'll transition. Now it's going to get stuck here because, again, we have no way out. But if we go ahead and hit compile, it'll go back to here. We can hit is falling. You'll notice it goes to here and then goes back to here. It may not be playing back right. We're going to adjust those in a second. But let's go ahead and finish up our other transitions. Jump loop. Well, this one should be pretty simple. Jump loop. So when does it go from looping to ending? Well, it's only looping because we're in the air. So let's take is falling. And if we hook this up, well, it's not going to work. We don't want to know when we start falling. We want to know when we end falling. So we do a not, which will basically turn it around. If it's true, not becomes false, and now it's false. So when we are not falling, that's when we can transition from the loop to the end. Our last one, jump end to idle walk. We already know how to do this one. If we go back to our start to our loop, we did a ratio. So let's do the same thing with this one, except there's another way of doing it. So if we type in remaining, we actually get a different one. We get a relevant remaining. So this one will actually automatically fill in based on the animation that's before it. So we can do a relevant anim time remaining fraction. And this does the same thing. We still get that partial value, the ratio. It's just this knows that the relevant animation we have hooked up is jump end. So you don't have to know exactly which animation you were using beforehand. We'll do the same thing before, less than or equal to. If it's less than or equal to, let's say 10% less, we'll go ahead and transition out. We'll compile and save. Let's go back to our graph here and look at the preview. And now we can actually toggle through. And you'll notice it runs all the way around. It doesn't look smooth. And there's a reason for that. We'll look at that in a second. But you can actually see it's running like it's supposed to. And if we were to check our speed, you can see when our speed goes greater than 0, we start our walk. Cool. Great way of testing everything. How can we fix those really weird issues? Well, these are pretty simple. If we were to unhook this one, you'll notice before when we had nothing hooked up, our jump start kept repeating. That's because our animation is set to loop. So we'll open up the jump start, we'll go to the play to third person start, and we'll undo loop animation. We're going to have the same issue when we end. So let's go to locomotion, jump end, uncheck loop animation, and save and compile. Let's see what happens now. That looks a little better. He goes up, the animation starts to finish, it transitions over, he's in the air, and it goes back down. And the nice thing is you can adjust how fast things play back. Maybe you want him to play back faster when he's looping in the air. Maybe you want the transitions to blend a little bit better. You can see we have blend settings here. So like when he goes from ending to landing, so let's test that out. You notice when he lands, he's got a little bit of landing, a little bit of shock with his knees. We can make it where there's none. We want no blending. We'll go to 0 and compile. And you notice when he lands, it just goes bam, straight to it. It kind of doesn't look right. And that's what our blending's for. Different types of blending, different types of durations, a little bit more oomph between one animation and the other. Lastly, there's one really neat thing when you're working with the different blending and the rules, is there's automatic rules. So we saw in here, we wanted this to go from here to here when we have a Boolean. But these other ones, the start to loop and the end to walk, were based on the previous animation. Well, you could use the automatic rule based, and it's basically going to determine as best as it can when the right time is. And a lot of that right time is going to be based on the animation playing back. So if we go into our transition rule here and we disconnect it, so we'll go ahead and disconnect and compile, we'll get an error. We'll go back to our locomotion for ending to walking, disconnect it and compile. We'll now have 2 errors because there's now no way of going back between these things. And we'll turn on automatic rules based for both of them and compile. You notice our error is gone, and we'll test. And you'll notice, okay, we've got pretty much the same effect. You'll notice on the ending, though, we don't really have much of that oomph when he's landing. That's because our blending duration isn't very much. Let's go with like 0.5. And we'll compile. We'll try that, see what happens. And there you go. You notice he's got a little bit more blending between the landing animation and the walking animation when it goes back. And that's all done without having to determine a time or any variation using automatic rules based. So that is going to be the basics of setting up our little state machine. The problem now is if we were to play this, well, we don't have much of a transition. See, our jump works like we expect. We don't have much of a difference between the walking and the idling. We're not really blending very well. And that's because we aren't using what we should be using, which is a blend space. So let's go ahead and take a look at blend spaces really quickly. Let's go up to our top and create asset and make a blend space 1D. We want 1 dimension, so our speed is going to drive it between different animations. We're going to go ahead and put it in our My Content folder, and we'll just call this one Zombie Idle Walk Run BS. And then it'll open it up. Now we have our basic blend space. We briefly covered how these work, but let's look at setting one up. So what name do we want for our axis? Well, let's name it speed because we're going to determine based on speed what we want to play back. We could use our grid divisions. These are all fine. What's our axis value maximum? Well, this should be the speed that we want to have our character move at when it plays back the maximum or the right side of our grid. We're going to go with something like 300. Easy enough. Don't really need to worry about interpolation until we've tested things. So how do we get it working? Well, we'll grab our idle, drag it, and drop it onto the left side. We're going to want our zombie walk to be up 1 notch. So now we have between the idle and the walk. And then we'll move our run to the end. So this mimics our basic. We have idling, walking, and then we can transition to running if it goes faster. Simple enough. We'll go ahead and save that. We'll go back into our animation blueprint. Inside of our locomotion idle walk, we can replace all this with our blend space. So we'll go ahead and go back into our asset browser here. Here's our zombie idle walk run blend space. We'll drop it in. It wants a speed. Well, we have a speed right here. That's easy enough. And it wants an output. There we go. We can delete the extra code we don't need, clean this up a little bit, go ahead and compile. And there we go. We can see a preview of our blend space. We can preview it here. As we can see, we can drag it along. We can see our little icon changing as need be. And we can see it going from idling to walking to running based on the speed input we put in. Now, of course, if we were to test this out right now, we're not going to get exactly what we want. You notice it's going to jump right to running. I don't have a gamepad, so I'm basically going to be 0 or max speed based on the character. So if we go to the character and we go to the character movement and we look at max walk speed, this will determine the max walk speed, well, when you're at full tilt. In this case, I want to do it to 75. 75 matches in my blend space this value right here for my walking. So I'm going to cap my character at a walk speed. If we go back and test it now, you'll notice he's walking at 75 speed and he's got the little zombie. You might notice it's kind of snapping between the idle and then the walking. And that's because we never adjusted the interpolation time in the access. And that's where we can adjust how quickly it goes between one animation and the other. And of course, you can adjust it to make it smoother as your animations need.